Successful businesswoman refused to represent black judge. What she did next stunned everyone. She said no. In front of a packed courtroom and under the weight of cameras, she refused, not quietly, not politely, but with the force of a woman who'd built her empire one investor pitch at a time. Savannah Lee Morgan, the nation's most celebrated tech CEO and the face of grit and digital disruption in post-recession America, looked a black federal judge directly in the eye and said, "I won't represent you." Gasps cut through the room like a blade. In that moment, it wasn't about policy or profit. It was about race, power, and the invisible lines drawn by privilege. But what happened after? That's what no one saw coming. Because somewhere between headlines and reckoning, between her spotless reputation and the judge's quiet strength, something began to unravel. In a nation fractured by doubt, fear, and forgotten voices, one woman's very public rejection became the catalyst for something wholly unexpected: redemption. This isn't a story about courtrooms or companies. It's a story about conscience, about what happens when arrogance collides with truth, and a woman the world thought untouchable is forced to confront the mirror she spent a lifetime avoiding. Stay with it. What she did next changed everything. Because a woman like Savannah Lee Morgan wasn't supposed to change. Not her. Not the one they called the Steel Magnolia of Silicon Hill, the Texas tech queen who built an empire on innovation, capital, and sheer charisma. She was the keynote speaker at every conference, the face that filled Fortune magazine, the success story mothers pointed to when telling their daughters, "See, you don't need anyone to build something big." But behind her 1,000-watt smile and perfectly tailored suits, Savannah carried something darker, a sense that the rules didn't apply to her. That wealth erased history. That good intentions excuse bad behavior. So when she looked across the courtroom and refused to represent Judge Franklin Dupree, a black man born in the heat of Georgia's civil rights movement, who had fought tooth and nail to bring fairness into a system built to ignore men like him, it wasn't just a refusal, it was a fracture. A moment that split the room in two. You could feel the air pull back. The cameras clicked, but what they didn't capture was the silence that followed. Not a dramatic one, but a cold, stunned stillness, like the kind that rolls through southern storms just before the lightning strikes. Savannah didn't flinch. She adjusted her watch, crossed her legs, and smiled, not cruelly, but with the poise of someone who'd never been asked to question herself. Judge Dupree said nothing. He didn't need to. The man had stood on bridges cracked by police batons. He'd carried law books through doors where he wasn't welcome. That day, he nodded, as if to say, "I've seen worse. I'll see this through too." But it wasn't just about that moment. It was about everything it stood for. Because somewhere in that courtroom sat a nation watching, not through screens, but through memory, through the long shadow of segregation, through the weight of 1,000 small humiliations, the raised eyebrows, the lowered voices, the seats never offered. And when Savannah turned away from Judge Dupree, she wasn't just walking out on a man. She was walking out on the very people who once believed she might be different. And yet, this is where it gets complicated. Because the truth, the messy, human truth, is that Savannah wasn't a villain in the classic sense. She didn't wake up one morning and decide to be cruel. She was raised in a world where being right often meant being the loudest, where success could excuse almost anything, and where people who challenged your certainty were considered obstacles, not teachers. She had spent decades building, winning and earning her success. And like many who've only known forward motion, she had no idea how to stop or how to listen. But life has its way of delivering reckonings, not in shouts, but in slow, relentless whispers. That night, after the courtroom emptied and the headlines exploded, Savannah didn't go to dinner with her lawyers or hide behind press statements. She went home alone to the high-rise condo overlooking downtown Austin. She opened a bottle of wine she had once saved for celebration, and she sat in the silence she'd spent years avoiding. It was there, in that expensive quiet, that something cracked, not all at once, but enough for her to replay that moment. The judge's stillness, the hush in the gallery, the weight of her own words hanging in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. And for the first time in her adult life, Savannah Morgan began to question herself. Not her brilliance, not her ambition, but her blindness. The next morning, she showed up. Not in court, not on a talk show, but at a community center in East Austin, where the staff didn't even recognize her at first. No cameras, no press, just chairs being folded, coffee brewing in the back, and a volunteer named E.J. Holloway who looked up and said, "Can I help you?" She said, "I think I need to learn how to sit in the back of the room for once." No one knew then what that moment would become, that she would cancel her speaking tour, that she would return every unearned dollar to the victims of her overreach, that she would call Judge Dupree not for forgiveness, but for conversation. And that call, 2 people, 2 lives, 2 Americas, was the beginning of something new. Redemption doesn't arrive like a parade. It comes like a letter you weren't sure you deserved to open. And sometimes the first step isn't doing what's right. It's admitting you didn't even know what that meant. So stay with it. Because what she did next wasn't loud. But it mattered. It still does. There's something you learn when you lose everything. Not just your job or your savings, but the illusion that the system was ever built with you in mind. Ernest E.J. Holloway learned that the day he had to tell his youngest daughter she wouldn't be going back to college. Not this semester. Maybe not ever. He stood in the hallway of their modest home in Jackson, Mississippi, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter like it was the only thing holding him upright. He had done everything the right way. 30 years as a public school teacher, never missed a mortgage payment, voted in every election since '84. After his wife died, he kept going for the kids. He taught Shakespeare to high schoolers who barely wanted to read, scraped together enough from tutoring to build a small nest egg. And when Savannah Morgan's company promised to revolutionize healthcare in underserved communities, it didn't feel like a gamble. It felt like a solution. He wasn't chasing riches, he was chasing stability. So when it all crumbled, when the headlines broke, when the funds vanished, when the polite emails stopped being answered, E.J. didn't rage. He didn't march into court with signs or interviews. He went quiet, like so many do. But silence doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes it means a man is figuring out how to rise with what dignity he has left. Miles away in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Margaret Maggie Odell was going through her unraveling. She had retired after 42 years as a nurse, most of which were spent in a public hospital that couldn't afford new linens, let alone advanced technology. She'd seen people die without comfort. She'd washed bodies that never got a proper goodbye. But she believed in care, real care, the kind you don't bill by the minute. So when Savannah Morgan's team reached out with brochures, sleek, persuasive, and filled with promises of patient-first innovation, Maggie didn't need much convincing. She gave a chunk of her retirement. She introduced it to neighbors. She believed. And when it collapsed, she didn't just lose money. She lost face. She lost trust. Not in Savannah, but in herself. That's the hidden damage of these betrayals. It's not just the checks that bounce, it's a shame. The way good people, intelligent, decent, responsible people, begin to question their judgment. They withdraw. They fold inward. Because in America, we don't just ask, "What happened to you?" We whisper, "Why did you fall for it?" But they weren't naive. They were targeted. They were chosen not despite their vulnerability, but because of it. Because they were hopeful. Because they still believed change could be engineered, that help could look like progress, that someone like Savannah Lee Morgan might mean what she said. And so, their loss was layered. Financial, yes, but also spiritual. Yet here's the part you won't see in spreadsheets or court summaries. They kept showing up. EJ went back to tutoring after school, not for income, but because a kid needed help with algebra and didn't have a father around. Maggie started volunteering at a community clinic, offering to sit with the hard cases because she knew how to hold pain without judgment. They didn't become bitter. They became necessary. When the trial came, they didn't want revenge. They wanted clarity. They wanted to look Savannah in the eye and say, "You didn't just hurt us. You distorted something sacred." And when they spoke, it wasn't theatrical. It was deliberate, strong, human. It reminded everyone in that courtroom what justice is supposed to protect. Not just order, but worth. The quiet, steadfast worth of people who don't headline anything, who won't trend, but who carry this country on their backs every damn day. So when Savannah finally looked up, really looked, it was into eyes that didn't accuse, but bore witness. To everything she'd taken. To everything they'd survived. To everything they still were. And that, not the verdict, not the sentence, was the moment the tide began to turn. He had long ago stopped believing that justice came with applause. Judge Franklin Dupree sat at his bench the same way he once sat on his father's porch in Selma, Alabama, quiet, still, listening. He had grown up not just reading the law, but watching it happen to his people. He remembered the crack of billy clubs, the way his mother's hand would tighten around his wrist when they passed certain streets. He remembered how his uncle, a preacher with a baritone voice and no shortage of righteous anger, was arrested for gathering without a permit. The law wasn't always fair. It wasn't always just. But it was real. And Franklin learned early on that if he could speak its language better than the men who used it against him, he might just have a chance at changing its tone. He didn't become a judge to punish. He became a judge to hold space for dignity, for truth, for the people who had been told their voices didn't count unless spoken in perfect grammar behind polished desks. And now, in this courtroom in Atlanta, with Savannah Lee Morgan seated before him, the woman the media once dubbed the blonde miracle of Texas, Franklin found himself remembering all the faces that never got this far. She had hurt people. There was no question about that. But what struck him wasn't the scope of her deception, but her calm. She sat like someone accustomed to being listened to rather than being challenged. Her posture told a story long before her lawyers did. This wasn't a woman defending herself. This was a woman expecting to be forgiven before she'd even admitted fault. Franklin had seen it before. Not always from women, not always from white folks, but always from those who had only known success, only known a world shaped to accommodate their ambition. And yet, he wasn't angry. Because anger in the courtroom doesn't move mountains, it hardens hearts. And Franklin knew that what Savannah had done didn't require fury. It required clarity. So he listened. To every word, every file, every quiet breath from the gallery when a victim's name was read. He watched the way Savannah glanced at her phone when E.J. Holloway cried. He noticed how her smile faltered for half a second when Maggie Odell described selling her house. These things mattered, not because they proved guilt, the evidence had already done that, but because they showed something more profound, that Savannah wasn't heartless. She was distant, untouched. She had built a life so high above consequence that she no longer recognized pain when it sat in front of her. Franklin knew what that kind of blindness cost. He had once sentenced a 17-year-old boy to 10 years in prison for armed robbery. The boy cried. His mother collapsed on the floor. And though the law was followed to the letter, something inside Franklin broke that day, not because of guilt, but because justice without humanity is just a sentence. So now, with Savannah's fate in his hands, Franklin wasn't thinking about punishment. He was thinking about what she might remember 5 years from now. 10. When the headlines faded and the silence came. He didn't want her to remember a courtroom that scorned her. He wanted her to remember one who held her accountable and still saw her as someone who could do better. So when he delivered her sentence, 28 years, no parole, and full restitution to every victim, he didn't raise his voice. He said it slowly, steadily, like a man who understood the weight of words. And then, after the bailiffs had taken her away, and the reporters rushed to file their stories, Franklin stayed seated for a long moment. Hands folded, eyes on the empty chair where Savannah had sat. He whispered something to himself. Not a prayer, not a victory, but a promise, that even if the world forgot what happened here, he would not. Because justice is not what you do when people are watching. It's what you insist on when no one thinks it matters anymore. It was the quiet that struck her first. Not the judge's voice, not the cameras clicking behind her, not even the tearful exhale of someone in the gallery when her sentence was read aloud. No. It was the silence that followed. A stillness so sharp, it felt like the whole courtroom had stopped breathing just to let the weight of her fall echo longer. Savannah Lee Morgan had been sentenced to 28 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole. Her assets, the homes, the stocks, the glossy investments that once made her name shine on every financial list worth reading, were to be liquidated and not sold and not salvaged. Liquidated, as if melted down into something unrecognizable, something no longer hers. She didn't cry, she didn't argue, but something behind her ribs tightened. Not panic, not fear, but the beginning of understanding. Until that moment, justice had always been abstract to her, a thing for people with low incomes, for the guilty, for the headlines. Not for her. Not for someone who had spent her life building what people applauded. She had been the keynote, the closer, the woman who'd made it without apology. And now she was being measured, not by her profits, but by her consequences. She heard the judge's voice, low and certain. He spoke with the kind of gravity that made every word feel permanent, as if carved into the walls of that courtroom. He didn't lecture. He didn't grandstand. He just told the truth. You believed they were too poor to fight back, he said. Today, they proved you wrong. Savannah had once built a brand around being bold. That was what they called her. Bold, brave, brilliant. She'd heard those words for years, seen them printed under her face, praised on podcasts. But now, bold meant something else entirely. It meant the courage to sit in her mess, to listen, to not be defended. She scanned the faces in the courtroom, not the lawyers or the reporters, but the ones in the second and third rows, the ones who had spoken, not like victims, but like people reclaiming something that had been taken. E.J. Holloway, Maggie Odell, others she didn't know by name, but recognized by pain. And by something worse, disappointment. Because disappointment is personal. It means they believed you. She looked down at her own hands, manicured but suddenly useless. She used to close deals with these hands, sign contracts, wave from a stage. Now they shook, just slightly. She folded them in her lap to hide them. The bailiffs waited by the door, respectfully, like men who understood that the real sentence had already landed. The years were just a number. The loss of certainty, of identity, that was the real price. She thought of her father, who taught her how to negotiate a raise when she was 12. Of her mother, who'd ironed her first blazer before a high school debate. Of the mentors who said things like, "Take up space, don't apologize." They were all right in a way, but none of them had taught her how to lose well, how to admit harm, how to be seen, not as powerful, but as human. And that was what was happening now. She was being seen, fully, not adored, not envied, but seen. The judge's gavel came down not with anger, but with finality. She stood. The courtroom didn't boo. No one yelled. There was no applause either. Just that same silence, deep and echoing, as if the building itself was watching to see who she would become now. Savannah didn't look at the cameras. She looked one more time at the judge, and then at the people who once believed in her. She didn't smile, but she nodded, not as a gesture of defiance, but of beginning, because sometimes the most challenging part of justice isn't the sentence. It's what you choose to carry out of the courtroom. They took her watch first, then the rings, then the blazer that once carried boardroom power in its stitching. Savannah Lee Morgan stood in a narrow room, fluorescent light buzzing overhead, as a correctional officer inventoried what used to be her life. The process was clinical, efficient, stripped of small talk and significance. Her name was typed onto a sticker. Her ID number is sewn into the fabric. Just like that, she became property of the system she had once believed herself too successful ever to enter. No headlines followed her in, no admirers, just the quiet. Her cell was colder than she expected. The kind of cold that came from stone, not temperature. The type of cold that reminded you were not meant to feel at home. A steel bed, a bolted sink, walls that didn't echo. She sat on the edge of the cot, too proud to curl up, too hollow to rest. That night, someone slid an envelope through the door. She hesitated, then picked it up. Handwritten, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, folded with care. She unfolded it, and the name at the bottom stopped her breath. Ernest E.J. Holloway. Dear Ms. Savannah Lee Morgan, I never thought I'd write to you. After what happened, after the savings were gone, after I sat in front of my daughter and told her college wasn't happening this year, I told myself you didn't deserve another second of my time. But last week, I saw something on the news. You didn't look proud. You looked human, tired, stripped down, maybe for the first time, real. I still don't forgive what you did. I don't think I ever will. But I do believe people can change. If you're one of them, prove it. Not to me, to yourself. Become the woman we once hoped you were. The one who spoke about dignity, access, and giving back. That version of you. She's not dead. She's buried. And only you can dig her out. You hurt a lot of people, Ms. Morgan. But you can still help someone, even if it starts behind bars. Ernest E.J. Holloway. She read it once, then again, and again. Each sentence felt like sandpaper against the polished surface of her old self, abrasive but necessary. There was no anger in the ink, no hatred, just something far more challenging to carry: expectation. She placed the letter down on the thin mattress, sat in silence. For the first time in weeks, she didn't think about how far she had fallen. She thought about the version of herself that EJ still believed might exist. Not the brand, not the speaker, but the woman behind all of it. She leaned forward, elbows on knees, and buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders began to tremble. There was no audience, no camera. Just Savannah, stripped down to bone and soul, finally feeling the cost of what she had done, and the weight of what she might still become. The tears didn't come all at once. They started slow, confused, but they came. Not for the sentence, not for the shame, but because someone she had wronged, believed she was still worth saving. And in that moment, the prison didn't shrink her. It gave her a mirror. Stories like Savannah Lee Morgan's aren't about good or bad, guilt or redemption. They're about the choices we make after the world stops clapping. If you were in her shoes, or in Ernest Holloway's, what would you do? Would you hold on to the pain, or offer a path forward? And if you were sitting where you are now, a listener, a witness, what lesson would you take with you? I'd love to hear your thoughts. How did this story move you? What stayed with you? Drop a comment. Remember to like, share, and subscribe if you want more stories that don't just entertain. They ask something of us. Every word you leave behind helps me keep going, keep writing, keep telling stories that matter. Thank you for listening.